After almost 2 years of negotiations over the fate of Gaza, Israel just shot the negotiator. Yesterday evening, Israeli warplanes launched an airstrike against a new set of targets, not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not in Syria, Yemen, or even Iran. The strike came against the sovereign nation of Qatar, nestled in the Persian Gulf between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, a nation that the United States designates a major non-NATO ally, and that the world worked alongside the United States and Egypt with to broker an end to the war in Gaza. In Qatar, the highest-level leadership of the Hamas organization was targeted for Israeli assassination. The strike comes with seismic implications for the entire Middle East. Urgent questions absolutely must be answered. Did Qatar know about the strike? What will Qatar do in response? And what does this mean for the war in Gaza? Other questions demand immediate explanation as well. Why was Hamas even present in Qatar? How did Israel manage to carry out this attack? And could this lead to an even wider war in the Middle East? Right now, the dust over Qatar has barely started to settle, so here's what we know, and here's where this conflict could end up next. The targets. Okay, before we discuss a rapidly evolving situation like this, we've got to have a word about timing. Everything that we discuss in this episode is accurate to the best of our knowledge and ability as of the morning of Wednesday, the 10th of September, local time in Qatar and Israel. As such, anything that's happened after that time will not be accounted for in our discussion today. Now, Israel's airstrikes on Qatar took place in broad daylight in the afternoon hours, local time, on Tuesday the 9th in a residential neighborhood within the capital city of Qatar near to multiple international embassies. The series of strikes happened quickly, with bystander footage that includes the sound of multiple explosions in rapid succession. The strikes leveraged long-range air-launched missiles launched from outside Qatar's airspace after they were carried into range by Israeli fighter aircraft. Codenamed Operation Summit of Fire, the strike targeted high-ranking members of the militant terrorist organization Hamas in the nation where those high-ranking leaders have taken refuge from Israel since 2012. Among their number was a man named Khaled Mashal, who's been Hamas's acting leader since October of last year. Mashal's a famous figure in the larger Israel-Hamas saga. In 1997, he was the target of a famously botched assassination attempt by Israel's Mossad spy service when he was poisoned by agents who were then captured and held until Israel provided an antidote to save Mashal's life. Alongside him at the time of the strike, and taking part in a meeting to discuss ceasefire terms with Israel, were most of the high-ranking Hamas officials who live in Qatar. Among their number was chairman of Hamas's political bureau, Mohammed Darwish, the political figure, Musa Abu Marzouk, the financial head of the organization, Zahir Jabarin, the acting chairman of Hamas's political bureau, Khalil al-Hayya, negotiator Izzat al-Rishk, international spokesman, Hassan Badran, and several other leaders, aides, and personal bodyguards. According to the international press, the group had gathered to discuss a peace proposal, one that would bring a quick end to the war in Gaza. By some media accounts, the meeting was so important that some of the Hamas members present had flown in from Turkey, where the organization maintains another set of officers outside Gaza. The proposal Hamas was considering was one that Israel had already accepted as of last Sunday, the 7th of September, with terms that would have seen Hamas release its remaining hostages, living and deceased, in the first 48 hours of a 6-day truce, during which time a permanent ceasefire would be hammered out. When Israel's acceptance of the deal was announced on Friday, that news was accompanied by a, quote, last warning by US President Donald Trump. As Trump wrote on his social media platform that day, quote, the Israelis have accepted my terms. It's time for Hamas to accept as well. I have warned Hamas about the consequences of not accepting. This is my last warning. There will not be another one. Exclamation point. On the following day, Hamas confirmed that it had received new proposals from the United States and that it was ready to release all living and deceased hostages in exchange for a permanent end to the war. Some disputed reports, citing primarily Israeli sources, suggest that Hamas decided to reject the deal, while others suggest that the meeting that was hit in Doha was done with the intent to reach a position either way. The death toll from the attack is in dispute, at least at the time of writing, with Israeli sources initially claiming that the strike killed Hamas's leader Khaled Mashal and the other senior figures present. Hamas, however, insisted otherwise, through a spokesman based in Turkey. According to Hamas, 6 people were killed in the strike: a Qatari security officer, a trio of bodyguards, the son of one of the leaders present, and an aide who directed affairs in that same leader's office. But Hamas has indicated that the entire leadership group that was targeted in the strike had survived. To be clear, it's relatively common for Hamas to falsely claim that key figures survived Israeli airstrikes, while it's also relatively common for Israel to announce a successful assassination only for the person who's supposed to be dead then turn up alive at some point later on. The implications. Okay, now as important as the death or survival of these Hamas leaders would be, there are a lot of other implications to discuss, not least the fact that this was a deliberate, premeditated airstrike by Israel on a sovereign nation that Israel is not at war with. When we said at the outset of this episode that instead of negotiating for an end to the Gaza war, Israel shot the negotiator, we were not kidding. Qatar, alongside Egypt and the United States, has been a key mediator in the attempts to establish a peace in Gaza since the Israel-Hamas war began in 2023. And to be clear, the fact that so many Hamas leaders were in Qatar was not a surprise to anyone who understands the way Middle East diplomacy works, least of all Israel. For many years, Qatar has made it a policy to engage with highly controversial non-state actors, allowing them at times to set up shop on Qatar's territory, and that's for a very good reason. It's an ugly truth of geopolitics that if any conflict with an unsavory non-state actor is going to be resolved with peace, then somebody around the world needs to have diplomatic connections with that non-state group. That's what Qatar does. It's what Qatar has done for Hamas since 2012. And until now, the arrangement suited everybody. According to the White House, Israel did provide the US advance warning of the strike, but only in the most literal possible sense. According to a wide range of sources speaking to the global press, Israel contacted Washington to inform the Americans of the impending strike only after Israel's warplanes had already released their long-range missiles toward Doha. The United States then scrambled to contact Qatar as quickly as possible, but by the time they were able to speak to Qatari officials, the first strikes had already begun. To explain why Qatar didn't react to the incoming strikes, there are a few possibilities, and in all likelihood, more than one of them reflects the actual state of affairs. Israel has at its disposal stealthy F-35 warplanes, which in turn probably didn't fly into Qatar's territory directly, but instead launched long-range munitions from international airspace or from the territory above another nation. Speaking of those F-35s, some analysts have pointed out that the United States would need to grant prior approval before sending F-35 warplanes into that area, although Israeli leaders did recently meet with a top American commander and may have received a more general green light to fly F-35s in a given sensitive zone. As for why the missiles weren't intercepted, Qatar does possess sophisticated air defenses, but those would be oriented toward the nation of Iran, a much more likely attacker and a nation that attacked a US airbase on Qatar's territory just this very year. If that's the case, then Qatar may have left significant air defense blind spots at their rear, where, for all Qatar knew, nations like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel had no intention of posing a threat. And to be clear, striking Qatar is not the same as striking a non-state actor like Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels, or even striking an adversary nation like Iran. Qatar is a designated major non-NATO ally of the United States, Israel's primary backer, and a nation that has a very positive relationship with Donald Trump, not least because they gifted the president a $400 million luxury jet a couple of months ago. I actually saw that jet at an airport in Morocco. It's very impressive. Although it acknowledged the, quote, worthy goal of eliminating Hamas, the White House made its displeasure with Israel known, quoting Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, unilaterally bombing inside Qatar does not advance Israel or America's goals. The president views Qatar as a strong ally and friend of the United States and feels very badly about the location of this attack. Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke immediately after the attack, and while the content of that conversation is unknown, Netanyahu seemed to understand that the United States was upset. Quoting his office in a statement after the fact, "Today's action against the top terrorist chieftains of Hamas was a wholly independent Israeli operation. Israel initiated it, Israel conducted it, and Israel takes full responsibility." According to the White House, Trump also spoke to leaders of Qatar and made clear that, quote, such a thing will not happen again on their soil. If the Hamas officials that Israel targeted did survive the airstrikes, then it'll be very interesting to see how Israel handles that American pledge. Unsurprisingly, the attack was condemned across the globe by most other nations. The third country to serve as mediator between Hamas and Israel, the nation of Egypt, issued a harsh criticism of Israel's conduct, as did Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the Emirates, and of course Iran across the Arab world. In Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and Spain all agreed that the attack was a clear violation of Qatar's sovereignty, no matter who the target of the attack had been, while Israel's few remaining international allies outside the United States pointedly chose not to weigh in. In Israel, however, The mood was quite jubilant. Opposition leaders praised Netanyahu's decision to launch the strike. News channels were positively awestruck by the deed, and Netanyahu's ministers made clear that they stand by Israel's actions. They've also referenced back to Israel's long-time insistence that it would hunt down and eliminate Hamas leaders wherever they were. As the chief of staff of the Israeli Defense Forces told reservists just last week, quote, "We're operating across the entire Middle East. Hamas will have no place to hide from us. Wherever we locate them, whether they are senior or junior figures, we strike them all the time." As for the strike's practical impact, international experts mostly agree that any discussion of a ceasefire is now dead in the water, and the lives of Hamas's surviving hostages are now at even more extreme risk than they ever were before. Frankly, it's hard to imagine any official statement from Israel that would have sent the message, "We do not intend to negotiate in good faith," as clearly as the decision to try and assassinate Hamas leaders who were literally in the process of discussing ceasefire terms on the sovereign territory of a nation that's been instrumental in getting the negotiations this far. Beyond the negotiations, Israel strikes have likely doomed Washington's Abraham Accords, an effort that would have seen Israel normalize relations with countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Oman, and indeed Qatar itself. For Israel to so flagrantly violate the sovereignty of a nation with no stake in its conflict against Hamas and an oil-rich, well-connected petrostate no less will almost certainly be enough to tank any further discussions and could even see nations like the Emirates or Morocco rescind the deals that they've already made. Finally, the ramifications for the war in Gaza will only become clear over time. If, as Hamas claims, the organization's leaders really did survive, then they may choose to abandon any hope of a ceasefire and direct their operatives in Gaza to make a final stand. That could end the war, but it would be a very violent conclusion, with remaining Hamas cells now turning their attention away from long-term survival and toward inflicting as much damage upon Israel as possible before they go down. In that world, certainly, the lives of Israel's remaining hostages would be forfeit. If Hamas's senior leaders really did perish, then the organization is effectively decapitated, leaving its operatives on the ground in Gaza to fend for themselves. That possibility could be even more dangerous for the civilians of Gaza and for Israel's troops, although the situation for the hostages likely wouldn't change. And there is a final possibility to consider, potentially the most dangerous of all, that if Israel is willing to do this in Qatar, then it might be willing to do the same in Turkey. That's the other key location where Hamas stations a set of officers and personnel. Qatar, with its small, defensively oriented and technologically inferior military, is highly unlikely to engage in a meaningful military retaliation after this. But if it was Turkey in the same situation, all bets are off. Try this in Turkey, and Israel would be violating the sovereignty of a nation protected by NATO's principles of collective self-defense, putting the US in an impossible situation. It would be targeting a nation with a powerful military led by a strong man who's trying to become a leader in the Middle East and whose domestic troubles could disappear, at least temporarily, if he can unify his nation against an external enemy. A couple of days ago, that possibility was unthinkable. But so was the airstrike Israel just carried out in Qatar. Today, we're watching a very different Middle East, where unfortunately, anything seems to be possible. Thank you for watching.